In the middle of the Southwest desert, hundreds of million-dollar locomotives are left to rot. These machines vanished from railroad records and were never recovered. Despite critical shortages and a booming rail industry, these train graveyards remain undisturbed, visible only from space. How did America end up abandoning so much value in plain sight? And what secrets lie beneath this epic industrial mystery? A single set of coordinates in the Mojave Desert opens up to a much broader story. Across the American Southwest, the map reveals a pattern: clusters of abandoned locomotives, each one a marker of industrial retreat. 4 sites stand out: Sema, California, Cobre and Gerlach in Nevada, and the Eagle Borax sighting also in California. These are not isolated curiosities. At Sema, satellite images show rows of rust-red engines stretching for hundreds of yards, with at least 40 units visible in a single cluster. Cobra, tucked away in northern Nevada, holds more than 30 locomotives, their hulks arranged on forgotten sidings that have not seen maintenance crews in decades. Gerlach, perched on the edge of the Black Rock Desert, adds another 30 or so to the tally, while Eagle Borax, a name left over from the days of mineral booms, hides a dozen more, half swallowed by drifting sand. The numbers add up quickly. Public satellite imagery and rail historian counts place the total between 200 and 500 locomotives scattered across these graveyards. Some sites are so remote that only the faint grid of rails hints at their existence from above. Others, like the sightings near Sema, are visible as long, parallel scars on the desert floor, each line shadowed by the outline of a locomotive stripped of paint and glass. In Nevada, the graveyard near Cobre grew rapidly after the late 1980s, when railroad mergers and route abandonments left fleets without a home. By the early 1990s, time-lapse aerials show the sidings filling up, engine by engine, until the lines blur into a single rusted mass. These graveyards are not just a curiosity for rail fans. They are large enough to show up on Google Earth, their scale visible from space. In some cases, the clusters are so dense that they resemble industrial towns, except no one lives there, and nothing moves. The desert climate preserves the metal shells, slowing the decay, but offering no hope of return. Each site anchors a chapter in the story of American railroads, places where the economic logic of abandonment outweighed the value of recovery. The distribution is deliberate. Railroads moved surplus engines to these remote sidings, far from public view, and even farther from scrapyards or repair shops. The logic was simple: out of sight, out of mind, and out of reach for anyone hoping to haul them back. Now, decades later, the pattern is clear: a documented, visible network of industrial relics, each site a silent witness to the choices that left hundreds of million-dollar machines stranded under the open sky. Railroad historian Mark Hemphill stands over a battered binder, its pages yellowed from decades of use. Inside, rows of locomotive numbers, GP35s, SD42s, march down the columns, each line a record of a machine that once hauled freight across the Southwest. Hemphill traces his finger to a block of entries from 1989. Here, the roster lists 47 units assigned to the Southern Pacific's Nevada division. But in the disposition column, a blank space appears where there should be a sale, scrap, or transfer note. Instead, the trail stops cold. That's where the detective work begins. Hemphill and other rail historians started by cross-referencing these incomplete rosters with satellite imagery, combing through Google Earth for hints of rusted hulks in the sand. It wasn't long before they found a match: a string of locomotives near Cobre, Nevada, lined up in the same order as the missing units on the roster. The serial numbers, when visible, match the builder plates from the 1970s and the early 1980s, confirming that these weren't just any engines, but the very ones that had disappeared from official records 30 years earlier. Fieldwork added another layer of proof. On a sweltering August afternoon, Hemphill and a small team navigated the dirt tracks outside Gerlach, Nevada, GPS in hand, and roster printouts tucked under their arms. They hiked past sun-bleached ties and tumbleweeds to the edge of the graveyard. There, the numbers stenciled on the cabs, like SP7421 and 7434, matched the roster's missing entries. The builder's plates, sometimes pried loose, sometimes still bolted under layers of dust, confirmed the locomotive's identities: EMD SD42s, built in LaGrange, Illinois, delivered in 1978 and withdrawn from service in 1991. Every match closed another gap, tying the paper trail to the physical evidence. This methodical approach, matching roster records to satellite images and then to serial plates in the field, turned rumors into documented fact. The same gaps appeared again and again. Units listed as stored or pending disposition in the late 1980s, but never formally retired or sold. Instead, they materialized in the desert, lined up in silent rows. The pattern repeated at SEMA, Eagle Borax, and other sites, each time confirmed by a combination of roster excerpts, on-site inspection, and builder's data. For Hemphill and his peers, this wasn't just about curiosity. It was about building a credible, evidence-based account of what happened to hundreds of valuable locomotives. The findings left little room for doubt. These machines didn't simply vanish. They were moved, parked, and left to the elements. Their fates sealed not by accident, but by deliberate decisions recorded in the paperwork of a fading era. A single locomotive parked in the desert might seem like an oversight. Hundreds left for decades point to something else entirely, a calculation that does not add up for anyone but the railroads. Each engine, even when stripped of parts, still holds between $50,000 and $200,000 in scrap metal and reusable components. But the math behind recovery is not as simple as weighing steel against market prices. Before any locomotive can be moved or dismantled, the entire process hits a wall of regulation. These hulks are loaded with hazardous materials, lead paint, asbestos insulation, and fluids that have leaked into the machinery over years of neglect. Under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, every step from initial inspection to final disposal requires permits. First comes a site assessment, then hazardous material testing, followed by abatement plans reviewed by state and federal agencies. Each stage brings fees, consultant costs, and months of paperwork. The Environmental Protection Agency, EPA Region 9 office, oversees much of this area, and their officials do not mince words. You cannot just show up with a torch and a flatbed. The costs pile up. Certified contractors must remove asbestos at rates that can hit $30 per square foot. Diesel and lubricants must be drained and disposed of as hazardous waste. Lead paint scraping and soil testing add tens of thousands more. Even a basic permit for hazardous waste transport can run $20,000 to $50,000, and that is before a single bolt is loosened. By the time all compliance steps are met, the total remediation bill for a single engine can soar past $200,000, often reaching $300,000 or more. For older units, the EPA may also require soil remediation around the wheels and undercarriage, especially if oils or coolants have seeped into the ground. A cost versus value comparison tells the story at a glance. Scrap value on one side, regulatory expenses on the other, the lines never crossing. For every locomotive sitting in the desert, the paperwork alone can outweigh the price of the metal inside. And this is before anyone considers the cost of cranes, trailers, and the challenge of reaching a site miles from the nearest paved road. The regulatory burden turns each recovery attempt into a losing proposition, long before the first piece of equipment even arrives on site. Getting a locomotive out of the desert is not just a matter of finding a buyer or a scrapyard willing to take it. The physical barriers alone are daunting. Standard diesel locomotives weigh anywhere from 200,000 to 400,000 pounds. Moving even a single unit requires specialized cranes in the 200 to 500-ton range, machines that are themselves rare and expensive to mobilize. For sites like Sima or Eagle Borax, the nearest paved road can be miles away, with nothing but soft sand and eroded dirt tracks in between. Building a temporary access road wide enough to support a multi-axle transporter can run into six figures, especially if the terrain floods or shifts with the seasons. The logistics do not stop there. Once a crane is on site, crews need to set up stabilizing mats, rigging, and safety barriers, sometimes working in triple-digit heat. The locomotive must be lifted onto a modular transporter, an oversized trailer system with a dozen or more axles, designed to spread the weight across desert ground. Each mile of haulage multiplies the risk and the cost, especially if the route crosses washes or requires permits for oversized loads on public highways. Insurance alone can add tens of thousands of dollars to the bill, given the risk of environmental damage or accidents during the move. For many graveyard sites, the nearest rail connection is long gone, torn up years ago to save on taxes and maintenance, leaving only the option of a slow, expensive overland haul. But even if a salvage crew manages to solve the engineering puzzle, another problem waits in the paperwork. Ownership of these locomotives is often a black hole. The wave of railroad mergers and bankruptcies that swept through the industry in the 1980s and the 1990s left asset ledgers in disarray. The Union Pacific and Southern Pacific merger in 1996, for example, involved asset schedules with thousands of rolling stock entries. But hundreds of surplus units were simply excluded as non-core or pending disposal. When a railroad declared bankruptcy, trustees sometimes listed equipment as abandoned in situ, meaning left wherever it happened to be parked. Title was never formally transferred, and no clear successor emerged to claim responsibility. Rail legal experts point to a tangle of uniform commercial code filings, bankruptcy dockets, and merger agreements that rarely match up. In some cases, title to a locomotive may have lapsed entirely, defaulting to whoever owns the land beneath it, or to no one at all. Attempts to recover or scrap these units often stall when no party can produce a clean bill of sale or proof of ownership. Without a clear title, permits for hazardous material removal or transport are impossible to obtain. The result is a deadlock. Even if the money and machinery are available, the legal vacuum leaves the locomotive stranded year after year as the cost and confusion only deepen. Railroad accountants faced a simple question: what is more profitable, paying to remove a locomotive or letting it rot where it stands? The answer, buried in tax codes and insurance policies, favored abandonment. Under Internal Revenue Code Section 165, companies could claim a full deduction for equipment written off as abandoned. By leaving a locomotive in the desert, the railroad not only avoided the steep costs of hazardous material cleanup and transport, but also booked an immediate loss on their ledgers, sometimes offsetting millions in taxable income. Insurance premiums dropped as well, since parked assets on remote sidings carried less risk than those in active yards. The math rewarded inaction. But the financial benefit for the railroad came at a different kind of cost for everyone else. Each abandoned engine still held the industrial legacy of its era. Asbestos insulation packed around exhaust manifolds, lead-based paint flaking from the cab, and diesel residue pooled in cracked sump tanks. Over years of neglect, these toxins seeped into the desert soil. Environmental scientist Dr. Lena Torres has spent years studying contaminated rail sites across the Southwest. She points to field reports from sites near Sima and Gerlach, where soil samples show elevated levels of lead and hydrocarbons within 20 feet of the rusting hulks. In some areas, asbestos fibers have been found in surface dust, carried by wind across the dry flats. Torres explains that the regulatory limbo, with no clear owner and no official cleanup, means the contamination spreads unchecked. She says the longer these locomotives sit, the more likely their hazardous materials will migrate into the environment. It is not just a visual blight. It is a slow-moving public health risk. The ledgers balance for the railroad, but the environmental bill remains unpaid. The very incentives that make abandonment attractive on paper ensure that pollution lingers, invisible but persistent, in the heart of the desert. In the summer of 2004, a scrap contractor rolled heavy cranes onto the Eagle Borax siding, aiming to recover a dozen rusted locomotives that had sat untouched for nearly 2 decades. The plan was straightforward on paper: cut up the hulks, haul the steel to market, and pocket the difference. Permits were secured, crews assembled, and equipment staged at the edge of the desert. But by the second day, the operation ground to a halt. A stop work order arrived from the Environmental Protection Agency, citing hazardous materials, old asbestos insulation, lead-based paint, and leaked diesel, none of which could be handled without a complex, multi-stage abatement process. The contractor's invoices piled up, but not a single locomotive left the site. Months of litigation followed, draining resources until the salvage firm abandoned the project altogether. The loss was estimated at $500,000, with nothing to show but a row of scarred shells and a stack of legal threats. For scrap operators, the lesson was clear. The risks and costs of recovery in the American desert outweigh any hope of profit. One contractor, still holding the faded paperwork from Eagle Borax, summed up the experience. You can buy the best crane in California, but you can't outspend the lawyers or the EPA. This deadlock stands in sharp contrast to what happens overseas. In Europe, government-mandated recycling programs require rail companies to take back retired locomotives. The EU Waste Directive, enforced since 2008, means every locomotive must be accounted for, processed, and recycled in certified facilities. In the United Kingdom, scrapyards dismantle hundreds of units each year, with nearly all materials recovered and hazardous waste safely contained. Japan and China run state-backed programs that funnel obsolete engines directly into recycling streams, turning what would be abandoned relics into reusable resources. There, the process is routine, regulated, and most importantly, completed. The American desert, by comparison, is a graveyard born of policy choices. Every failed recovery attempt, every rusting engine, is evidence of a system where inaction is cheaper than responsibility, and where the solution is less a matter of engineering than of law. Today, hundreds of locomotives still rust in silence, monuments to policies that reward abandonment over responsibility. As more trains reach end of life, these graveyards quietly expand, leaking toxins and value into the desert. Until the rules change, their shadows will spread. Sometimes, what we leave behind says more about us than what we build. What's your take? Join the conversation in the comments.